The fireworks between prosecutors and defense attorneys continue this week as more damning evidence comes to light in the quadruple homicide case of Bryan Kohberger. In the latest flurry of court filings, the prosecution produced more incriminating evidence pointing to Kohberger. In addition to an Amazon purchase back in March of 2022 of a K-bar knife, sheath, and sharpener, Kohberger also purchased a black balaclava from Dick's Sporting Goods in January of 2022. This newest revelation bolsters eyewitness testimony from surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen, who described an intruder wearing a black mask that covered almost his entire face, leaving only his eyes and bushy eyebrows exposed. Mortensen also drew a composite sketch of the mask for law enforcement. Defense attorneys continue to argue that Mortensen's memory was highly impaired due to the large amount of alcohol she consumed that night, and that it's impossible to identify their client as the perpetrator based on bushy eyebrows. In fact, the defense is attempting to have the eyewitness testimony of Mortensen completely thrown out for the upcoming trial. They also want the Amazon purchase of the knife and sheath thrown out due to Kohberger sharing a family account with his parents and siblings. The defense claims it is impossible to prove who actually made the purchase. In other filings, the prosecution hinted that it might call members of Kohberger's family to testify at his upcoming trial. In her argument, Latah County Senior Deputy Prosecutor Ashley Jennings asked that if any members of Kohberger's family are listed as witnesses for the prosecution, they be excluded from the courtroom until after they testify. The defense, however, is asking that Kohberger's immediate family be able to attend the entirety of the trial, and that family members of the victims should not get priority over the family of their client. A motion was filed by the defense asking Judge Hippler for clarity on which family members are allowed to attend and when. According to a March 17 filing signed by defense attorney Elsa Masseth, Mr. Kohberger's Sixth Amendment right to a public trial would be violated if his family is excluded. Prosecutor Ashley Jennings disagreed, and wrote in her response that while Kohberger has a right to a public trial, it does not extend to the defendant's choosing who sits in the courtroom. The defense has also asked the judge for an order that relatives of victims be prohibited from wearing T-shirts with the victims' pictures or messages that promote the state's new firing squad execution law, which members of the Goncalves family have previously worn at hearings. Arguments over the DNA evidence continue to remain a point of contention for the defense and prosecution. Scene 2. State's plan for DNA introduction. The state plans to introduce it as an anonymous tip, but just how they plan to pull that off without bringing in the backstory of the IgG work remains in question. Scene 3. Testimony on the tip. The state claims they will be meeting with its prosecution and investigation team to identify who will testify about the receipt of a tip on or about December 19, 2022, and the subsequent actions taken by investigators and the state. Scene 4. Defense's impression. The defense, however, has been under the impression that the state would drop the DNA evidence after agreeing with prosecutors that the IgG work will not be presented at trial. Prosecutors claim that it is unclear what the defendant means in the last sentence of his reply, since this testimony will be sanitized for presentation to the jury to avoid the IgG process. It must also not falsely suggest that there was any other evidence or tip that led the state to Mr. Kohberger. There is substantial evidence gathered both prior to the tip and subsequently, leading to Mr. Kohberger being the person responsible for the November 13, 2022, homicides and burglary. The point the defense has been attempting to make is that without the IGG work, there would have been no arrest of Bryan Kohberger. They claim every search warrant, including the arrest warrant for Kohberger, was based on faulty and illegal methods. While this argument is based on FBI agents accessing backdoor methods to gain entry to millions of private ancestry records, leading to subsequent matching of Kohberger DNA on the knife sheath, it seems it has fallen on deaf ears with Judge Hippler. As for Bryan Kohberger's alibi defense, the state points out that Kohberger appears to now acknowledge that he does not have any witnesses, potentially other than himself, to establish where he was at the time of the crime. They claim that, at best, Kohberger's expert witness, Ray, can only testify generally to his opinion about where Kohberger was during the early morning of November 13, 2022. Prosecutors stated, "We know for a fact that cellular analysis cannot show where Kohberger was at the time of the alleged offense because his cell phone was turned off during that time." Prosecutors go on to argue that the court should enter an order prohibiting Kohberger from presenting any evidence other than from Kohberger himself, whether by direct or cross-examination, in support of any claimed alibi regarding the specific place or places at which the defendant claims to have been at the time of the alleged offense. This argument would require Kohberger himself to take the stand to testify in his own defense, which is highly unlikely. Kohberger is also planning to present an alternative perpetrator defense, but prosecutors are asking the court to grant their motion for an order prohibiting that, unless he can offer evidence to prove that a specific person is connected to the homicides. The state says mere inferences that another person could have committed the crime will most likely not be relevant. In addition, the defense is claiming that Kohberger has a diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder, which makes it impossible for him to have committed the homicides in the short amount of time the prosecution has outlined in their timeline. Prosecutors argued against that assertion, stating he was a young child when he received that diagnosis, and it's irrelevant today. That statement is bolstered by Kohberger's Strava running app details, which show him running a mile in 6 minutes, which is above average for non-professional athletes. In a second argument referencing Kohberger's autism diagnosis as a reason to remove the death penalty option, the defense claimed that in reality, his autism puts him in a category of persons who are less culpable, therefore making it even less likely Kohberger committed these crimes. Ann Taylor argues the jury is more likely to convict Kohberger based on their observations of his awkward behavior and reactions, which makes them biased. Taylor goes on to argue that Kohberger's ASD makes a fair and just trial a challenge. Another huge point of contention is the crime scene, specifically the house at 1122 King Road. Before the prosecution and defense agreed to the destruction of the house, prosecutors had planned to make a to-scale 3D model of the house. The state claims they no longer needed a to-scale model and ultimately settled on a not-to-scale 3D model as a demonstrative exhibit. The defense is now asking the judge to exclude these three-dimensional models, which Ann Taylor referred to as a dollhouse in emails between her and prosecutor Bill Thompson. She claims the state has yet to provide her with anything more than a crude drawing with no further information from their experts. Taylor stated she has been waiting on this information since the fall of 2023. Another shocking revelation that just came to light is Kohberger's thesis written when he was studying criminology at DeSales University. In what could be just an eerie coincidence, the subject matter is how to process the crime scene for a stabbing homicide. In it, Kohberger meticulously lists methods to eliminate and contain contamination by law enforcement. One of the biggest questions that remains about the crime scene at 1122 King Road is how did Kohberger manage to enter and exit without leaving anything behind, including blood or hair evidence? In fact, if it weren't for the slip-up of the lost knife sheath, it seems there was no evidence left at all. Lastly, we have the somewhat weird and creepy last photo taken by Kohberger of himself. Defense attorney Ann Taylor wants it excluded from the trial and claims it is not relevant and overly prejudicial. Questions remain about this photograph though. Why did he take it? Who is he giving the thumbs up to? And who, if anyone, did he send it to? These are all questions we should have answers to soon. Bryan Kohberger's trial is set to begin August 11, 2025.